Today I'm joined by a super exciting woman. She is Allison Davies. She lives in Tasmania with her husband and two children. She enjoys the beach, bush and baths. She is a cat person. I'm not sure we can be friends. I'm definitely a dog person, but second to cats, that's fine. And she's a former neurologic music therapist of 20 years, and she is now an educator. Please tell me that I said that right.
You said that all correctly. And I want to add, I also have a dog, and I hope my dog did not overhear me,
Or you're
but
going to
I
be in
secretly, it's my
trouble.
cats.
I
I also have two cats, and they're the secret keepers to my heart.
See, I say that I'm a dog person, but at one point we did have 17 cats. So, it kind of goes both ways.
17
Yeah, I know.
at once?
Yes, I know. I like to adopt strays. That's how I ended up with my husband.
I'm so excited because I've always thought that if you have more than three cats, you've crossed some kind of like line
Yeah,
into what people will think is okay.
yeah, definitely.
I've, I've never let myself have more than three.
Well, we had 17, now we have none. So don't go too far because you might not be
Okay.
able to come back from it.
Actually, this sounds like my chickens.
Oh,
I just wanted a few, but they keep sneaking off and having babies and bringing them all home, and now we've got a whole flock, too many to count.
so I am an animal person. My husband is not an animal person. And I wanted chickens, and he did not want chickens. So I was just going to get two chickens. And then I thought, well, I'll just get five more. And then I thought they all look the same to him anyway, and he can't tell the difference. So I got 10 more. So, it's what's the difference between seven chickens and 12 chickens, really?
Especially when we're in the midst of an egg shortage. Like it's an investment in our
100%.
futures, really.
Yeah, but my chickens couldn't tell the difference between them and my little dog. So my husband would come in and find all the chickens and the dog around the fire inside.
Oh, that is so cute.
He did not think so. Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent already. So can we start? Can you tell me what a former neurologic music therapist actually is?
Yeah, so former just means I'm no longer registered.
That was the one new I
Neurolog,
meant.
yeah, that's the one word that makes sense.
Yeah.
Neurologic music therapist. So I was a registered music therapist in Australia for almost 20 years. And I trained with the Academy of Neurologic Music Therapy so that I could specialize like specifically in the using the relationship between music and the brain. So music therapy itself works in a lot of different realms, I guess you could say. Music impacts our emotions, our physiology, biology, our spiritual wellness, and so many different facets of it. But neurologic music therapy focuses just on how music is impacting the brain and what music can do to make the brain do particular things to help us attain or maintain therapeutic goals. So, for example, when I was a neurologic music therapist, I was working a lot with people who'd had a traumatic brain injury or a stroke, and we were using music as a form of speech rehabilitation. And it's a very prescribed process because the brain is science, neuroscience is science, the way we're using music is just science. So it's all there's a whole like method, and you sort of follow it step by step, and it's incredible. But I also found that neurologic music therapy felt a little bit like the atheism of music therapy because it wasn't in all of my other work as a music therapist, it wasn't prescribed. It was always moving and it was different for every person. And it was, yeah, it was a really, really beautiful modality. Music therapy has been the biggest pleasure of my life working as a music therapist. It's who I am. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about music therapy. As in, I don't even know how to phrase the question. How does music therapy actually work?
Well, firstly, music therapy is an allied health profession, right?
Mm-hmm.
So music therapists are like OTs, speeches, psychologists. And that's important because a lot of people do think because it's about music that we're like volunteers or music people from the community doing nice things with music. And all of those things are equally valid and important. But music therapists have all gone to university to study music therapy and have a lot of training and background in how music impacts our body, how it impacts our emotions, how it impacts our brain and our nervous system. And so when we work with people, music is our tool, but we're therapists. So we're working with people as therapists. There will be usually therapeutic goals.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the goal might be to have relational safety or to have meaningful interactions in community or um, to develop or use fine or gross motor skills. And what no matter what the therapeutic goals are, we're using music-based interactions as our therapeutic tool. So it always looks different.
Mm.
Like I couldn't count how many different types of ways I've used music with different people to attain different therapeutic outcomes. It's the options are endless. But yeah, I mean, if you picture speech therapy, where
Mm.
speech therapists are using speech tools or tactics, there's a better word for it than tactics, but to attain speaking outcomes, we're using music to attain therapeutic outcomes.
This is so not where we were going to go with this interview, but I'm fascinated because I've been one of my kids has been sort of accessing therapies, so physio, OT, that kind of stuff, since she was born. But I've actually never heard of music therapy. So I'm, which is
Yeah.
terrible, but also, like
No,
20
no, no.
years in, how have I not heard of this? But how does music lead to relational safety, or how does music lead to gross motor skills?
So, for example, with relational safety, when we experience music, our brain loves music because
Mm,
of repetition, because of melody, rhythm, all these different facets
yeah.
of what our brain experiences all at the same time when we listen to music helps our brain feel in control, and it soothes our nervous system so we feel safe. It stimulates then the release of dopamine in the body. So we often correlate the feeling of music as something that feels good
Mm,
and feels enjoyable. So when a music therapist come to work, often I found that, for example, if I was working in aged care with people with dementia, because they knew I was the music therapist, we automatically had relational safety, even if I hadn't worked with them yet,
yeah.
because they knew I was walking in the room with a guitar, not a needle or a clipboard or meds or,
Yeah.
I was not doing anything invasive or uncomfortable. I was always coming to do music. So the very fact that we relate music with something safe and enjoyable creates a foundation for relational safety. And then a therapist will go, so if we keep going with this example of working in aged care or people with dementia, then I would start conversation around mapping out significant music or songs or musical experiences from someone's lifetime, songs that their parents listened to when they were little, or songs that were at there, maybe a song that was at their wedding or that they listened to at school, or if they were in a musical. And so we're creating a foundation of meaningful interaction. And that is where relational safety comes from. And when people are experiencing safety in their connection with you and their interaction with you, that impacts them throughout the day. So then they might have a greater window of tolerance for when the nurse does come in to change them or toilet them or whatever happens next. So it's hard to explain exactly what happens in every session because it's
Oh,
always
so
so
different.
different.
Yeah.
But the brain is a musical organ. So when we experience music, more of our brain is active all at the same time than it is when we experience any other thing,
Wow.
anything. So because music is like, I think of music as like a umbrella term for all of these musical elements. There are so many things that make up what we think of as music. There's melody, rhythm, frequency, vibration, even silence. Like you literally cannot have rhythm without silence.
Mm-hmm.
And tempo, so speed, volume, all of these different things. The brain reacts to all of these things differently. And so almost the whole brain becomes active when we're listening to music, but not just listening to music, making music or even thinking about it. So if we have a song stuck in our head, or we're singing a song in our head, or listening to something on the radio, our brain is still having that full active experience as it would if we were actually making the music.
Oh, wow.
So our brain seeks music-based input all over the place, constantly all day long. There's music in our environments, there's rhythms in our environments, there's melodies in our environments and frequency, and it gathers sensory input that the brain perceives as musical to determine whether we're safe or not. And our brains have been doing this throughout the whole of human history. So they're very good at going, oh, that rain sounds too heavy and too fast. So the vegetables are going to wash out that I just put in the ground yesterday, or I need to get the things off the line. And so our survival is based on how well our brain can make sense of musical cues in our environment. So when it comes to actually just listening to music or being musical, our brain is already just a total gun at all of those things. And it has such a profound impact on the state of our mood and the state of our nervous system. And the information about nervous system really wasn't available when I was first studying 25 years ago when I did my Master of Music Therapy. That's new again. And the information about trauma and regulation and the nervous system and how music can soothe is just incredible. And it's very, very exciting time for really understanding all that stuff about trauma and the nervous system.
So you did your study 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Have I been living under a rock? Like, is music therapy well known?
Yeah, it's very well known.
I have been living under a rock.
Okay. So there's the Australian Music Therapy Association. I think they must be about 50 years old. Like, it's been going for a long time. There are not many music therapy jobs. So you will not go onto JobSeeker and find a job for a music therapist advertised. Where there are music therapy jobs, they are highly sought after and everyone wants them, so they're never usually coming up. But so the jobs that where you can get employment as a music therapist is like in the Children's Hospital in Melbourne, in the hospital in Brisbane, in the hospitals in big cities where they have teams of music therapists, teams of music therapy in oncology, teams of music therapy in the burns unit and pediatrics. Other than that, for the most part, we need to be our own business people and be getting grants or, seeking our own employment, which is what I've always done. And most music therapists work in aged care and in early childhood sort of areas. But there are music therapists working all over the place. Music therapy is a really highly sought after service under the NDIS. I am kind of surprised that you haven't heard of it.
Me too. Like, seriously, this has been so different. Therapy has been my life for 20 years and I have never heard of it. And I've been connected to, it was at the time Princess Margaret Hospital here in Perth. We've spent a lot of time at the hospital. We've spent a lot of time with specialist services that are around providing services for people with acquired brain injuries.
Wow.
Never heard of it.
It fascinates me. I
wish I'd heard about it 20 years ago.
I know. Well, yeah. I mean, I think music therapy still gets a bit of not a bad rap, but so 40 or 50 years ago, occupational therapists were sort of laughed at and mocked, and they were called basket weavers.
Yeah.
I think that's still a little bit where music therapy is. Like, oh, the music. People used to say to me all the time, did you have to do any kind of training to do this job?
And
well, I had 6 years at uni. So I think because it's music, it's still not necessarily seen as the health industry that it is. And not enough people are referring clients to music therapists. I have talked to clinics of GPs and I've done so many in-services in hospitals. And it's very rare that someone from a hospital I've never had someone from a GP refer someone to me. So really it's other allied health services that are going, oh, have you tried music therapy, and recommending music therapy. But outside the allied health industry, I've never had anyone from sort of the more mainstream medical model reach out. I have a couple of times in the hospital with people who've had strokes, but it's very rare that people are referring, doctors or medical model are referring music therapy.
And I say this with love, as somebody who definitely identifies as a hippie chick. But, it feels like something that's still seen as kind of a bit hippie and out there. But
oh, yeah.
Even with that, those are the circles I run in. How have I never heard of this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a saying, like, music therapy isn't just kumbaya around the fireplace, you know?
Saying
It's
that,
very,
there's definitely space for
it's
kumbaya around
science.
a fireplace, but yeah.
I want to do that too.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is hard to get for music. It has been hard for music therapy to get the legitimacy that we deserve. However, in saying that, there is tons and tons and tons and tons of academic research. I've contributed to academic research there's many academic music therapy journals, and there is so much evidence base behind music therapy. So there's no lack of evidence base available or academic research available. I think it's just in people's minds the thought that it's not as and even just in the last 6 months there's been questions about whether music therapy will continue to be offered as a therapy under the NDIS. Bill Shorten said it doesn't have enough evidence base. The whole industry is based on evidence and research, so there's no lack of it. Music therapy often is also one of the first things to be cut. If someone's having budget cuts, they're more likely to cut the music therapy than the psychologist.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it does have those kinds of little barriers. But as I said, also just being the music therapist puts me instead to have relational safety with clients because of people's experience with music being something that is safe and joyful. And not many people have negative or trauma-based connotations around music.
And I say this as somebody who runs an organisation that is filled with psychologists and counsellors. I don't think, and my background is in psychology. I don't think that the same can be said for psychologists and talk-based therapy. So, we often will find with clients who come in and go, oh, well, I don't want to see a psychologist or I don't want to see a therapist again because I tried that once and it was terrible. And, so I often say to people, have you ever bought an absolutely gorgeous pair of shoes and you put them on and you got blisters? Did that stop you wearing shoes? No, you just got a different pair, or you had to, you tried wearing them in, didn't work, you went and got a different pair, and actually sneakers are better than 6-inch heels for you. So, we talk about that with therapy, but you're right. I've never had an experience with music and gone, oh, do you know what? I'm actually traumatized by that.
Yeah, I can't do music anymore.
Yeah.
You just change the CD, or not CD anymore, but
change
the playlist.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
So how did you get into music therapy?
Well, when I was in high school, well, really all my life, music has been my main thing. So I'm also autistic and ADHD. I'm an ADHD, so I'm an AuDHD, as they say these days, which is autistic and ADHD.
Do you say that?
Yeah, I do. I definitely, I don't ever say I'm on the spectrum because I don't understand what that even means. It's like a spectrum. What is that? People do say things like that to me, like, oh, you must be on the high end of the spectrum. And I'm like, oh, you don't understand autism. So I just avoid that whole thing. I don't say ASD because the D at the end stands for disorder and that doesn't cut it. So yeah, I just say I'm autistic. But also ADHD is a really big part of it. And most people are both. So if you're one, you're most likely going to be both. And I say that because for people listening, a lot of people still don't know that because we used to only go down one path of assessing one or the other. And there's especially a lot of women these days who are receiving their ADHD identity or getting clarity around that, which is great, but they don't yet realize they're also autistic. So it's just a really good thing to explore both. And FYI, people.
And I'm gonna come back to the question that I asked you about how did you get into this, but just while we're on that, do you think there's still a level of stigma around autism, which is still sort of more existent than a stigma around ADHD?
Yes. I personally don't use the word stigma to describe it, but I would say misunderstanding, I'd say stereotypes, I'd say internalized ableism. People still think autism means more disabled than ADHD, or that it's like more something less than, oh, what's a good way of describing it? ADHD seems to have a less life-altering vibe to it than autism does. I didn't say that well. I don't know how to explain.
For me, it feels like ADHD is like quirky and fun, and I'm a magpie. Whereas autism feels like oh, that's still scary. That's I'm trying to find a way to put this in a
Yeah.
politically correct way, but you know, it like you said, people
More
with
disorder-like.
autism. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
there's
do still think that exists, unfortunately. And so
I think people with
I,
autism are also quirky and fun. Just putting that
yeah,
out there.
when you say quirky and fun and I'm a magpie, I think autistic. Because when I think of ADHD, I think of like executive functioning difficulties, can't remember to do the thing, always late, forgot to turn up for the interview, didn't do the thing, forgot school pickup, can't organize, on the floor in tears because I can't get lunches done, all of that stuff, seeking adrenaline and dopamine to give myself some shot at being able to get through the day and all of those things. And I think of everything else as autism. So I really just think of ADHD as executive functioning.
Okay.
And if there's sensory differences, if there's quirky personality traits and all of the other things, I put that in the autism box. But of course, there's no actual box and it's not as black and white as that. But that's a good way to think of it. But the reason I brought all this up is because how I got into music therapy is that music was the only thing. As a child, I thought music was keeping me alive. I didn't know I was autistic, didn't know that I was seeking regulatory tools, didn't realize that I was seeking auditory input or that I needed pattern recognition and I needed consistency and predictability and repetition. So I was playing music because it was providing all these things to me and it felt amazing. And it was the only thing that brought me joy and it was the one thing I was great at. And so I just went through school just pursuing music. And then I thought, I don't know what I want to do. I guess I'll just do music. And so I just followed, I did a Bachelor of Music and a Bachelor of Education. And then I somewhere heard about music therapy. As soon as I heard about it, I can't remember where I heard about it, but when I heard about it, I was like, oh, that's me. So it wasn't like, that's what I want to do. It
Yeah.
was like, oh, that's me. So then I did a Master of Music Therapy at the University of Queensland. And that's where it all started.
So you were saying that when you were a kid, this music felt like it was keeping you alive, and at the time you didn't know that you were autistic. So at what point between music keeping you alive and now, when did you go through that whole process of diagnosis or suspecting that you had autism and ADHD?
The diagnosis came when I was 36, and that came on the back of the first autism diagnosis, well, in my children. So we're all ADHDers.
Yeah.
But you start with one assessment and then it all starts to become clear and you go to the next assessment, the next person, same assessment, next thing, and we just go through it. So at the time when my one of my children was having their autism assessment, that's when it all became very clear to me that I was autistic. And I had just been being treated for postnatal depression, which I always knew felt incorrect because I did not feel depressed at all. I wasn't sad. I wasn't depressed. I've always had a very high sense of self and I was sleeping fine. And I never thought that this would be what depression felt like, but I was nonverbal and I was unable to function very easily. And I was very emotionally imbalanced and having a lot of meltdowns, very classic autism stuff. And so it all just clicked into place one day for me. And I woke up, I had a dream about it actually. In the dream, I realized I was autistic. And then I woke up, like what happens in the movies where you wake up and sit up,
Yeah.
like one just bolt. But that never actually happens in real life. But that's what happened to me when I had that dream. And I just went, oh, I'm autistic. And then this was before people knew that it was genetic,
Yeah.
so this was still back when like it was just like oh my gosh, what?
Yeah. What are the
And
chances that two people in the same family have it?
yeah, yeah. And then I just all night, I just laid in bed. I didn't go back to sleep. I laid in bed looking over my whole life through the framework of it, of being autistic, and everything made sense. Everything that I thought, like secretly when I was a kid, I thought I had a secret anger problem that no one knew about because it was just inside me and it only came up when like my school dress touched my knees and all these things. Like everything made sense. I just laid there thinking, what if my husband doesn't believe me? When he wakes up and I say I'm autistic, what's he going to say? That was my biggest concern. And he was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. So I was like, phew, that's the hardest
thank
part
goodness.
over. And then I received my diagnosis quite easily. Of course, for kids, you're on a wait list for years.
Yeah.
Not so much for adults at that point. Yes, adults now, sometimes there's wait lists. That's when it all started. And so we've just gone through, like in the family, we've just gone through assessment after assessment for different things. And of course, having an actual clinical diagnosis is not necessary unless you do need it for particular reasons, and self-identification is clearly equally valid. And also it is so expensive and so difficult, and there are so many barriers to receiving an official diagnosis, including misdiagnosis, which people still get all the time. Get misdiagnosed with bipolar or borderline personality disorder, women being told that they're just highly anxious, which I think is just a rehash of what they used to say about women being hysterical. It's just it's highly anxious,
Yeah.
and therefore there's no need to search underneath for the biology of this. But when we look at it through the lens of neurodiversity and understanding that we all have neurotypes, when we explore our neurotypes, all of that anxiety and all of that stuff becomes very clear. So, but to receive an official diagnosis can be very hard and very expensive. So, exploring your own neurotype and coming to your own conclusions about it is a really, really great idea.
So it's interesting that you say that diagnosis isn't needed. And it could be to do with, your vibe attract your tribe and the people who happen to be in my social circle. But just about everybody I know is now self-identifying as autistic ADHD. Do you think that there is going to be, do you think there's a problem in that with people?
I, de- I, I definitely don't. And I'm very firm on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we under recognize our neurotypes. So the fact that everyone's starting to explore and recognize their neurotype now is it's like exploring and recognizing if we're left-handed or right-handed. Every single person knows. We know that we're either going to be left-handed or right-handed. We know it's genetic. We look for our kids. Like I have a left-handed husband, so I know with my kids, I was like, I wonder which hand they'll write with. And as soon as they start doing it, we're like, oh, it's this one or it's this one. It's like, I think, and I hope that it will become like that.
Mm-hmm.
Not like this. The reason that we think it might be problematic because so many people are self-identifying is because we still have this internalized sense of it being a disorder and not as common as what we think it actually is. And so it's challenging for us sometimes to see it so drastically increase in numbers of people who are self-identifying with a neurotype, but I don't think there's any evidence to show that it's overdiagnosed.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's not important to get an actual diagnosis. I think especially for kids, if kids need NDIS support, yes, they need it. If they need extra support at school, yes, it benefits that. I also think it's important. What I think is most important is to have clarity around what our neurotype is. So, whether that comes from self identifying or an official diagnosis, knowing that we're autistic is really, really important. It's something that a lot of people have avoided in the past because we don't, especially parents, people our age who grew up in a time where being autistic was different.
Yeah.
Did make life difficult. We were ostracized. We weren't given the same opportunities, and it was seen as a disorder and a disability. And well, it is disabling, but it was seen as something different to what it is now. So we have this deeply embedded fear that's been conditioned into us through how neurodivergence was seen when we were kids. And it's one that then gives us a bit of fear about our own kids. Like, I don't want them to be, when we say I don't want my kid to be labeled, what we mean is I don't want my kid to be discriminated against and judged. And that fear is legit because of what it was like when we were growing up. But the reality is that we're really quickly reshaping a whole world of how we understand brains and neurotypes. And it's less likely that our children will experience that kind of discrimination. And certainly hopefully our grandchildren won't, because by then everyone's just going to be talking about their neurotype.
Yeah.
And I really see that it's changing quickly.
I will admit, for me, it is the diagnosed people, so people with the diagnosis of ADHD or autism, it almost feels almost classist. Yeah, but they're, in inverted commas, self-diagnosed or Yordi, so whatever that might be. as opposed to they haven't actually done it properly. So she's just decided. And so I find that really interesting as well. Like I've got the badge that I paid $3,000 for, and she's just decided
That's
because she's
hard.
watched a reel on Facebook. So
Yeah, that's really hard. And I think it's within the autism community itself, people are not saying those things and thinking those things. People in the community who are learning about autism, advocating and ADHD, advocating, educating, understanding neuroaffirming support, understanding the neurodiversity framework, shedding old stereotypes. People who are sort of actively part of that community are wholeheartedly welcoming of and accepting of self-identification because there are so many like it was hard for me and I have a ton of privilege. It was hard for me to get my diagnosis. It was traumatizing. The doctor who diagnosed me traumatized me, and years later I went back and got a second diagnosis to see if it would heal something from the first, and it did. And I am someone who can articulate my needs. I'm educated on this topic. I'm a white woman. I'm straight. I'm well educated. I just had everything going for me that would
apart from the
support me in
fact you're
that
not a
process.
man, you were ticking every
Apart from the
single
fact that
box
I'm not a
for
man.
entitlement. Yeah.
And then I think of like the trans kids and the BIPOC community and people who have and intersectional communities who
Yeah.
have so much against them already within the medical industry and whose needs are not seen as autistic or ADHD because they're just seen as, oh, that's just part of their mental health problem or that's
Yeah.
part of their dramatic approach to blah blah blah. So there are so many reasons why people will try and go for a diagnosis and either be misdiagnosed or shunned or not given a diagnosis and they've spent thousands of dollars on it. There's people who will never be able to afford a diagnosis.
Yeah.
And they deserve to know their neurotype as well as someone who has the money. So it's extremely classist and problematic when people are like, oh, but I did it the proper way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. But it's interesting that you say that you found it like a traumatic experience with your diagnosis because so many women who I speak to find that diagnosis so affirming.
Yes.
Finally feeling as though they can understand themselves or as though there's a reason that they always felt other.
Yeah.
So it's
And
interesting that you didn't have that experience.
I didn't the first time, but that's because I got it done so long ago. And it was by a psychologist who was not neuroaffirming and was not aware that he was autistic. I mean, he clearly was, and just had all these rules about, like, he was just gaslighting. It was typical old school approach.
Yeah.
Once I knew better, I knew to find someone who was autistic themselves, find a woman, someone who would understand my lived experience. And so I went down the path of finding someone who I knew would be able to support me in the process because the assessment is it opens you up. Like the assessment itself, receiving the diagnosis is the best. So even though I had this traumatic experience with this first guy who diagnosed me, still receiving that diagnosis was one of the best days of my life. And then there was years of unpacking all the gaslighting that he'd done and all this, the how actually that impacted me. That was separate to the fact that realizing I was autistic. I'd already realized it myself in my dream.
Yeah.
So going through the process was a technicality, but yeah, it was so important. And that's why I love it for people when they get an official diagnosis or a self-identification. Either way, if they realize they're autistic or ADHD, it is so, so important for our lifespan because autistic people have short lifespans, far too short. In Australia, it's averaged 39 to 52 years of age for autistic people that are sort of typically or traditionally called high functioning. So people like me. Our life spans are too short. And that's because we're diagnosed with mental health conditions because we don't know how to accommodate our needs because we never learn about them or we're excluded. And so we don't have the connection we need to regulate or because we develop addictions because we haven't yet realized we're ADHD and that we need some Vyvanse or something in our life
Yeah.
or, all of this kind of stuff that will change. Those stats will change and our life expectancy and the meaningful lives that we can lead will change as people start to understand their neurotype. So the snowball impact of realizing what our neurotype is huge and extremely needed.
Mm-hmm. Can I just go back? You said the process of going through the actual diagnosis, you said that really opens you up and that you would like people to know about what that actual process does to you. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, you have to answer a lot of you get a lot of documents that you have to tick boxes in. None of the questions make sense. Well, as I'm sure you know, they're things like, do you prefer being alone or with other people? So an autistic person who reads that will go, well, hang on, this is brought on 200 more
Well,
questions.
that's
Like,
it. That depends. Give me more
what's the
information.
context?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like it was like when I was filling out the postnatal depression form. I've forgotten what that document's called, but
The
it's got
EPDS.
a name. And I'd be like, there's this question going, do you cry for no reason every day? And I'm like, what does this even mean?
Yeah.
I've got a baby. Like, what kind of reason? What's the reason for crying? Like, and what's a reason and what's no reason? And like, it's just like there is no way to answer that question.
Yeah.
And so, firstly, you're given all these documents that you have to do really random, weird questions, and they're all worded in negative ways, like, is this is a problem in your life and you suffer from, do you suffer from this, and does this stop you from being able to function in this way and this way? And it's all, you just have to keep in your mind that these documents and these forms are written from a deficit perspective.
That's really hard because, yes, I'm experiencing this, but I'm not suffering from it. Like it's
Yes,
impacting me every day, but who's to decide that this is
yes.
negatively impacting me?
And when you're doing these assessments on behalf of your children and you're
Yeah.
writing like,
Oh, that's hard.
yeah, it's so hard. You need therapy just to recover from it.
Mm.
So ultimately, you're getting what you need in sense of the diagnosis, hopefully. But I and when you're a parent going through the assessment process for your children, another thing that doesn't get talked about much but is horrifying is that you have to give very intimate and personal information about your children without their consent
Yeah.
to doctors. And there's never a process there where usually when you're going to get a referral or you're meeting your new psych or you're going for an assessment, it's not like you have already, in most cases at least, had a relationship built with them so that you can safely share this intimate information knowing that your children would never ever consent for you to
Yeah.
tell anyone that stuff. So you're already well aware that you're in this very hard space where you're essentially breaking trust and you have to do it and you're doing it for a reason, but there's been no safe therapeutic relationship developed before you get to that point. So you're straight in, you might just be on the phone or online with someone you've never met, and you're sharing really, really sensitive stuff that you know is meant to be not told.
Yeah.
And it's very, very hard. It it opens you up for days. You know when you go to a therapy session and you have a really hard session and you're talking about hard things and
Yeah.
then you're like you need to recover the whole rest of that week.
Yeah.
That's what it's like when you're going through the process of seeking referrals and assessments because it requires of you to speak to very hard things and
Yeah.
challenging things.
And what's really difficult is, like you say, you haven't created any kind of therapeutic relationship. It's not a safe space, and there's no support for you. So as parents, you're often putting yourself into really difficult, awful situations. But we're still in a space that this is often not talked about. So you can't even go to your peer group and go, do you know what? This really sucked. This,
Yeah.
that's horrible.
It really is. And I really struggle with that side of
Mm.
it. And so, you get, and also you do the documents, you got to fill out forms, but it's not just forms these days, which is great because they used to diagnose autism and ADHD just through looking at the criteria in the DSM-5, which is the book that says this is what autism and ADHD is.
Yeah.
And you've got to meet those things, those criteria. But now it also includes interviews about lived experience, like tell me about your upbringing, tell me about your parents, because we know it's genetic. So
Yeah.
also tell me about your friendships and tell me about this and this and this. So they're seeking a lot of information, and that's great. And sharing all that stuff, I love. I love to feel seen and heard. I love to share that stuff. It's healing for me to share that stuff, but it's also another thing that just opens you up. It's very vulnerable. It's very exhausting.
So it's healing to share that stuff, but it also depends on how that's received and what you get back.
Absolutely. And if you go through all that and someone says, "No, I don't think you're autistic," it sounds like
Sounds like you're bipolar.
it sounds like you're bipolar, or it sounds like your whole family has a history of genetic anxiety, or things like that are being said to
Yeah.
people. And it's like, I just want to say, well, what do you think is the actual name for genetic anxiety? What is its name? Its name is autism.
Yeah.
So there's still people going through all of that. And then based on who is doing the assessment and whether they have done their own professional development and learnt, moved forward with the times, knowing what we know now about neurotypes. If you don't get a person who's one of those, you often come home without your diagnosis, and you've gone through that whole process. And I'm not saying this to scare anyone off. I guess what I'm saying is, like, I would, and I do for me and my family now, really think, who do I want my assessor to be? And if you are privileged like me, and I know not everyone is, but if you do have the choice of like seeking someone to do an assessment, I would think it's worth waiting on a wait list for the right person, someone who you know is neuroaffirming, or understands the female experience of autism, which is very different to what's in the DSM-5.
Yeah, and I guess what we're seeing a lot of is people who are popping up and, well, you can get an appointment with this person within 48 hours. Why? And it might just be that, they might have all the things that you've just spoken about, but also they might not.
Yeah.
So what kind of questions would you be asking somebody who is going to give a diagnosis to make sure that you're getting that kind of support that you need?
Well, if I am doing an email to someone to first inquire where they have space, I will say things like, I am really looking for someone who is neuroaffirming and trauma informed as a starting point. And people will use often people will use those words because they think they're trendy words and everyone needs to say that they're neuroaffirming and trauma informed. But it doesn't mean that they necessarily are. So I will always go and look at their website. If they don't have a website, I'm already like, I don't know. I don't have enough to find information about this person, so I'm not sure if it's the safest choice.
Yeah.
So I always do prefer someone to have a website so that I can go and look them up. You can tell by the way people are writing about autism whether they actually are neuroaffirming. Because if they say, we're a neuroaffirming center who offers social development skills for autistic kids, for people with autism, then you realize, okay, there's a few things here. They're still saying people with autism, which doesn't align with the neuroaffirming or the neurodiversity framework. And if their first and main offering is like social skills development, then they're still doing like probably early intervention, which we now know is not necessary. And essentially they're teaching masking skills, and they might not be the kind of place that are really looking to support autistic people to actualize as autistic people. Maybe they're still trying to assimilate. So you can get a lot of information from looking at wording and looking at websites, but I definitely think ask around for people in your community, from people in your community, who their assessor was, how their experience was. I know I live in a regional area, and everyone seems to know the ones that the psychologists who do the assessments that are really neuroaffirming and really supportive. And yes, the wait lists are long, but when you ask around, you get a very quick and immediate response to like, don't go to that person.
Yeah.
Or yeah, that person's amazing, but they have a long wait list. And so that kind of stuff can give you information as well.
And so normally I would sort of try and wrap up by saying, if you know somebody who, or, so I'm going to do that twice. So my first one is going to be, because we're talking about autism and ADHD. If you know somebody who suspects that they may have autism or ADHD, or they have a friend or relative or child, what kind of advice would you give them to be able to live as their authentic self?
I would say really learn about autism from autistic advocates and educators, because when you read a textbook, so when we first get our diagnosis, the pediatrician or whoever signs off on it will give us like a brochures, and they'll lead us towards therapy, then early intervention. You don't necessarily need therapy. So just because you're ADHD or autistic does not mean you need therapy. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, yes, they would have been straight in with the saying like early intervention is best. The earlier you get in, the quicker you can change. But we know that the changing is actually not making us less autistic. It's just making us better at acting less autistic, which leads to all
More
sorts of
tired.
yeah, much more tiring.
Yeah.
And people end up with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So please know that you don't have to just immerse yourself immediately into therapy unless you need therapy or want therapy. There's definitely a place for it. I'm not saying that. It doesn't have to happen quickly because they've already been autistic their whole life. They're going to be autistic for the whole rest of their life. So it doesn't have to be this urgent, like, oh, they're autistic. We need to get onto this, blah, blah, blah. Like, take time, think about it, choose options that feel right for you. So it's okay to explore schooling options or homeschooling or unschooling options. It's okay to like try out therapists and go, no, that one isn't for us, and try another one. You can really take control over how you move through life as an autistic person. I would also say it's very important, if your children are being diagnosed, to explore your own neurotypes if you haven't yet. Because when you start to recognize that you are also autistic or ADHD, it will become so much clearer to you and make so much, your children's experience will make so much more sense to you, and you will be able to work on accommodating your own needs, and through that your family will start to implement autistic culture and live in ways that really meet our needs and accommodate our needs, rather than just fit the box of what people say you're meant to do when you're autistic. So there was a lot of information there, but what I would say to those people is like, take your time and do what feels right.
I think what is probably there's, like you said, there was a lot of information there, but one of the most valuable things that I heard you say is take your time. So like you say, you have been autistic for your entire life up until now. You will be autistic for the rest of your life. This doesn't all need to be sorted by Thursday.
Yes.
And that's probably one of the biggest things that I see is people going, oh my God, I'm autistic, or my child's autistic. I need to fix all of this now. And as you say, so many parents whose kids are going through autism diagnosis or ADHD diagnosis, it's hereditary. So the extra pressure of trying to sort all this now, somebody's going to crumble.
Yeah, especially when what mostly happens when our children get a diagnosis and parents start to learn that it's genetic. And it definitely is. And there's the research on that is just there's no questions anymore. We know it's genetic. But the hard thing is when parents go, oh, well, he must get it from his dad or the mother-in-law. Oh no, it's not me. Your sister's a bit oop. So like all of a sudden it's hard to truly understand neurodivergence when you can't recognize it in yourself.
Yeah, okay.
And so then because we can't recognize it in ourselves, we can only see it in potential in other people.
Yeah.
And when you get to the point where you do see it in, I would say like, think about yourself as if you are autistic and just see what comes up for you. Because when you recognize it in yourself, everything will become so much easier. Truly, like, it's unfathomable how much life changes when you recognize your neurotype. But, we're still in the early days of this whole exploring our neurotype era. And people are still saying things like, oh, everyone thinks they're ADHD these days. And, oh, here's another autistic person fad. It's not trendy. It's not cool. That's not why anyone's doing it. But I think as time goes on, we're definitely there's going to be a lot more support for people exploring their neurotypes. And so I think it's going to get easier for us all.
And say you were married to somebody who has just found out that they, or just realised that they have autism or ADHD, or they're autistic or have ADHD, what kind of advice would you have for them?
I would say, firstly, nothing about them has changed because sometimes we do go, oh my gosh, I married an autistic person, or like whatever. Because it's, there's nothing wrong with having deeply conditioned mistruths that we heard when we were growing up because that's what conditioning is. We do think that way sometimes, and it's okay, even though it's wrong, it's okay. It's not bad. So they haven't changed. There's nothing wrong with them. And I would say start learning about autism and ADHD from autistic and ADHD educators and advocates. Most people who are teaching about autism or ADHD have already done a lot of going through and recognizing their own internalized ableism and unpacking a lot of their own emotions and traumas and family stuff. And so by the time they're actually sharing information, it comes through a lens of like not just their experience, but actually this is the experience that comes from the community, from everyone's lived experience, plus from research, plus from academics and data. And so there are a lot of easy ways to find those educators and advocates. They're on social media, they're on YouTube, and I think that's the best way to start learning about it.
I think,
Also,
yep.
one last thing, we often find our people, so neurodivergent people are often married to and friends with neurodivergent people. So if you're in a circle where every single person you know is autistic, except you, then that's also an invitation to explore explore your neurotype because that could be the case, but also we tend to find people that we relate to. And so often it's both parents that are autistic or ADHD. And not always, but it's all of these things are just opportunities to self-inquire.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I will often say your vibe attracts your tribe because for exactly that reason, the tribe all tends to be neurodivergent. Yeah, and what has just came up for me before was around the social media. Like there's a lot of negatives for social media, but it is a space where people can come together and they can actually learn from community in a relatively safe way.
Yeah, absolutely. And do what you need to protect yourself. Like don't go into the comments or structure it how you need.
How
But
do you not go into the comments?
I know, especially as an ADHD, even though it's a form of
Self-torture.
self-torture, it's also a form of dopamine. And so we're doing these things. I often find myself going to pages of people I fundamentally disagree with just to get a rise in my body, just to feel something.
Yeah.
And it's not cool. It's not what I want to do. And I sometimes do it anyway. And I'll go to the comments on purpose, knowing I'm going to disagree with them. And I'll go and do it anyway. But yeah,
It's good to have
yeah, social
self-awareness though,
media.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then switching back to the very start of this conversation around music therapy, if you know of somebody who might be considering getting into music therapy, what kind of advice would you give them?
I'd say you definitely, it's a great idea because I have found my life as a music therapist to be so rewarding. It is such a huge part of my identity. So when I deregistered as a music therapist, that identity crisis was really profound for me. It's fulfilling, it's beautiful. We need more music therapy in the world. You look up music therapy universities in Australia. They offered it in a couple of places. And if you're also seeking music therapy for yourself or your child, if you're in Australia, you look up the Australian Music Therapy Association, and there's a button that says find a music therapist, and you click on it, and all the states come up, and all the music therapists in all the state, not all of them, but a lot of them in different states come up, and it says what they specialize in, and you can find music therapists that way. But no matter where you are, even if you're regional, there are a lot of music therapists around, so you will find some in your area.
I wonder if
So
there's probably more in regional areas.
I think there's probably more music therapists per capita in regional areas. So if you have like where I live, well, I'm not a registered music therapist anymore, but I'm the only one for a couple of hours that way and half an hour that way.
Yeah.
However, if you're in the city, there's more music therapists, but thousands and thousands more people. So it can be hard to get into music therapy because there's not enough music therapists for the need for music therapy. So most people have a wait list, but definitely worth looking into and definitely worth going through uni and studying music therapy and becoming a music therapist.
Fab. And as we wrap up, have you got any more? And we went all over today, so I really appreciate you coming for this little journey with us. But have you got any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I really just want to hold space for the people who are going through the process of diagnosis and exploring their neurotype, because it's, even though it's extremely rewarding and needed and liberating when you get there, no one's doing it for fun. No one's doing it to just excuse bad parenting. No one's doing it for any reason other than they need to. Like, we would not spend thousands of dollars and years on wait lists and referrals after referrals to do this for no reason. And sometimes our family don't understand it either, because a lot of the time they're also autistic and ADHD and don't know it and think that your situation or their behavior or what's going on is completely normal because it was normal for them because they're also autistic. And so you'll hear a lot of, oh, that's just how it is in our family. And there can be a lot of barriers towards getting the support in our immediate circle. And that's true for so many. So you aren't alone in that. And just keep doing it anyway, because we're the ones who are changing the experience of being neurodivergent for our children. And our parents one day will look at our grandchildren and go, wow, I wish I knew then what you know now.
Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much. And we will put details for the different links that you spoke about and where people can find out more information about the services that you have. They'll all be in the show notes as well. But thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.